LaToya Bolds Johnson sat in her car, in her driveway, the engine running. Just outside the car, her husband had broken down, screaming. It was his guttural attempt to deny the devastating truth of her diagnosis, which she hadn't even told him about yet, but he knew it. Husbands know. They can tell. It was because she was home from work early, and LaToya Bolds Johnson, a no-nonsense black mother from New Orleans now working in a Washington, D.C. emergency room as a physician assistant, was never home from work early. Oncology. Let's talk about the language of oncology, because it's laden with metaphors and borrowed terminology. Arguably, none are drawn from more heavily than the vocabulary that we use for war. We battle cancer. Oncologists have an armamentarium of drugs. And people with cancer, they fight. Unfortunately, though, people with cancer aren't just fighting a disease in their bodies. They're also fighting a system that at times seems to be actively working against them and can feel like a battlefield. Again, that's a battlefield of complexity. Now let's add a serious wrinkle. If you're a person of color, you may also be fighting a battle you can't see, that maybe you only feel, but can have a devastating effect on the kind of care you get and how long you live for. So let's reframe what fighting looks like for just one person, LaToya. Initially, LaToya fought the very idea of her cancer, because this most devastating news that brought her home early that day to process behind the driver's wheel of her car was delivered to her not by an empathetic, caring human being, but via text to her phone. Imagine that. A text that tells you you have a terrible form of cancer. She fought against the truth of it. It couldn't be happening to her. Triple negative, stage 3C ductal carcinoma. But before we even talk about the many, many fights that LaToya is in for next, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, body dysmorphia, we have to rewind. Because LaToya fought a fight to even get her diagnosis. It was months earlier, during the course of breastfeeding her third daughter. She'd felt a warning sign, a lump in her breast just seemed off, in the way that a simple clogged milk duct was not. On her own, she went for a mammogram. She had to fight to get one, because the radiologist was dismissive, hesitant to do the diagnostic. LaToya was too young. She was only 36. Even the tech gave her a hard time. "You'll be fine," she said. And then the diagnosis came. But LaToya kept digging. She saw that people with triple-negative breast cancer might be eligible for immunotherapy in some clinical trials. A certain cancer drug had shown positive clinical trial results in triple-negative breast cancer. She asked her oncologist to prescribe it to her, because she wanted to fight some more. But her oncologist said it wasn't on his checklist to prescribe. So take a guess what she did next. But for us, all of this begs a question. Why was LaToya fighting so hard? Why do people of color of all kinds even have to struggle to get access to treatment? Why don't clinical trials routinely include them? Why does their care look different? Why do they, quote, fear the sugar pill? With my two guests today, Ricki Fairley, co-founder and CEO of TOUCH, the Black Breast Cancer Alliance, and Nirzari Parikh, Executive Scientific Director at Avalere Health. These are the issues we discussed and more. That's all coming up next on Within Reach. If you distill the fundamental idea of healthcare down to its purest, most unadulterated form, the essence of it just seems so simple. When someone is sick, they should get the care that they need. And this should be true for all of us humans living right now, forever on the cutting edge of the future, riding around on this blue and green orb through the universe and living our shared history as a species. But there's a heartbreaking reality to healthcare, and cancer in particular. The messy and upsetting truth is that the number of people who can get the best care, if we can even agree on what that means, which we can't, is fractional. Untold numbers of people can't even get decent care, and millions of people get absolutely no care at all. So why is that? There are glaring, enormous problems plaguing medicine and medical systems around the world. How do we unwind them? How do we even understand them? And for all the individuals in the world with cancer who are struggling, how can we bring them within reach? Can we create actionable solutions that alter the course of their disease and of their lives? It's a lofty goal, but it's the one we're going to tackle right here. I'm Evan Young, and this is Within Reach from Avalere Health. Nirzari, Ricki, thank you both very much for coming on. I'm really delighted to talk to you today because I think we have a very hard, challenging, but really important topic to discuss when it comes to underrepresentation of Black people and other people of color in clinical trials today. So I'm looking forward to digging in. To get us started, as I was just doing some research, it feels to me like it's a topic that's just been in the healthcare zeitgeist for a long time. I mean, you could start to think about, maybe the 1980s or even earlier as when we really started to pay attention to this. But I think the way to enter into this conversation is very broadly to start. So what is our current understanding of the issue? Ricki, I think I'll kick that one to you first to address however you think.
So, the history is there, but I don't think it was really until about 1980s where clinical trials included more than 50-year-old white men. I mean, I think even for drugs that women take, which is pretty crazy. So it's not a new issue. It's been around for a while, but it's still kind of, I think, taking baby steps. I think just clinical trial recruiting is difficult in theory just because most people don't know what it is and don't really understand it. And they think they're going to get a sugar pill and die or whatever they think. There's a lot of historical racism for Black people in clinical trial space. But I mean, right now, the drugs that we're currently making for breast cancer, the space I work in, there's no representation. And right now it's about a 3% participation of Black women in clinical trials. And interesting, that number actually, if you Google that number, it'll come up that it's a fact from the FDA. I've talked to 20 people at the FDA who don't even know what that number means. Like, what's the numerator and denominator of that fraction? And tell me what that's relative to. So still, but 3% is really small. And I think that pharma has now of late been really trying to make an effort to recruit Black women into trials. And a lot of the work that I do, I feel very blessed to be able to have a seat at the table to help pharma recruit people. We did a research study now 4 years ago, basically, because I'm a marketing person. I want to understand what's in people's heads about clinical trials. And we talked to 300 Black women survivors and patients. And the number one reason why they don't participate is doctors don't invite us. Whether it's illicit bias, racism, whatever the things are, they don't invite us. But secondly, and equally important, is I think I'm going to get a sugar pill and die. And that basically sort of set up a light bulb in my head that people just don't really understand how a trial works, that there's standard of care, what standard of care is. People just don't know. But if you picked up the phone right now and called anybody in your family, would they be able to explain a clinical trial to you? And that you're going to get standard of care. And so I learned pretty quickly that if I could break down the science in words people can spell with a basic explanation from a voice of trust, sign me up. I want to do it. I want to try it. I want to be a part of it. And so that's what we do. And we launched our When We Trial campaign now 4 years ago. And it's basically an education program that explains the science in easy concepts. And we've now signed up over 33,000 Black women into our clinical trial portal just by talking in English.
So, Nirzari, I guess I'll let you respond to that. I mean, I have some thoughts just about who should be bearing the brunt of the messaging here, because if the message is, hey, you're not going to get a sugar pill, you're going to get best standard of care, just explaining the fundamentals of that. I mean, I think that's where my head goes to first, but what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. Ricki makes great points. So I'd say the tide is trying to turn. It may not have turned completely, but it's definitely there. Just the appreciation for the fact that there is underrepresentation in clinical trials. And just that, I think, is a big milestone in its own regard. And I think it starts with the pharma companies and the sponsors really to kind of bear some of that initial messaging, and then to make sure that the messaging for what these clinical trials are, what shape do they take? I think eventually it needs to move away from the academic institutions, but also kind of make its way to the community institutions or the community care practices, and then make its way to the patients. And I think right now where I particularly see the gap is where the flow of information is from the pharma company sponsors, mainly to the academic institutions, which is where most of the clinical trials do occur. So I think it's that flow of information, moving on from the academic institutions, which is kind of where the stopgap is. And we need to kind of almost open the tap of information so that it flows. There is ample information out there. I just don't think it makes its way through to the patient populations. And the fact that there are, clinical research trials that I could get involved in or that I want to enroll myself in. There's just that breakdown of information. There are a lot of silos, in my opinion.
I would say, I work with many of the pharma companies that make drugs for breast cancer. I feel very blessed and that they've brought me to this table to criticize what they do. And I spend a lot of time telling them their baby is ugly, but I'm going to help you fix it because the brochures are not well written. They're full of words that people can't understand. And we try to break down the science and put some love around it. And we rebuild the communication in ways that people will understand it. And then we have them on I have a web series. I have them on my web series. I have patients involved. And we have these conversations that really make the patients feel part of the conversation. I always say, we are the science we've been waiting for. And I feel like because our mortality rates for breast cancer for Black women are so high because stuff isn't working right now. And unless our community gets engaged in these conversations, we're going to keep dying because the drugs aren't made for our bodies. And so I can sort of make the argument on the side that the pharma owes it to us, but also, our community owes it to respond and be a part of these conversations. And that's what I try to encourage people to do every day. So we all have to do this work together.
The other thing I wanted to just kind of add here is there are many different barriers, right? Yes, we do think that the primary source of information should be pharma and the sponsors. But there are many different challenges to be able to make sure that you're representing all the different populations equally. There's language barriers, there's socioeconomic barriers. The fact that whether you have equitable care for your disease, for your cancer, are you close to a bigger city? Which means then you probably have access to an academic institution. If you're more rural, your chances are most of us are going to a community care setting. These community care practices just don't have that kind of operationalization. They don't have that kind of access to be able to even open some of these clinical trial sites. So I think there is a lot more to it, which leads to the underrepresentation. So it's a multi-pronged approach that I think pharma needs to have along with everyone involved to be able to kind of get over these barriers or roadblocks.
And it sounds like, if we want to call it a kind of a pathway to get a patient into a clinical trial, has a bunch of different weak points where it seems to be breaking, whether that's access, like you just mentioned, geographically, or socioeconomic access, or if it's trial availability or the offer of the trial, or mistrust. Am I going to get a sugar pill or historical mistrust? With all of these different breakpoints, what can the approach be? What is the approach there?
The approach that we take is to partner with pharma, but we have in place a nurse navigation team. And our navigators are all Black women. They're 24/7. So when the cancer center closes at 5 o'clock, they're available. Or when people are at work from 9 to 5, they're available. And they're all breast cancer survivors. So we provide this service to pharma to not only help recruit the patients into the trials, but to keep them in the trials. And so our team is on duty all the time. And we've actually had to become a vendor of the pharma companies because nurse navigation becomes a service as opposed to an advocacy job or whatever. And so we work really hard to build these partnerships. And we're now working with several of them to really help recruit the women and then keep them in the trials. And we know that our navigators, we know navigation works. There's been a lot of data about navigation, but just giving that level of support and hugs and emotional support and just talking people off the ledge, explaining what their side effects are all about and helping them get resources in their neighborhoods. And so it's been a really, really great tool. We want to do more of it. We can't do enough of it. But our team, the fact that they are survivors, they can talk the talk because they've walked the walk. They've been there, done that, got the T-shirt. They felt the same things, and they really understand what the patients are going through. And you can call them any time of day or night. How cool is that?
So I think what Ricki's mentioning, that's great. That's a lot of support for patients. But again, kind of taking a little bit of a step back more towards the sponsor pharma side, I think it's also important some of the other barriers which we have, which is, clinical trials by definition have a stricter eligibility criteria. So I think there has to be a little bit of more done in terms of understanding where these clinical trials can be opened up more in terms of eligibility requirements. Obviously, we've got to make sure that it's all safe for the patients who are entering the trial. But I think a little bit more research, understanding what are the comorbidity conditions that this patient population in this specific geography might have. I think understanding some of the existing conditions and then making sure that they translate that into the clinical trial design itself is also pretty important. And it's going to help as soon as you broaden your eligibility, your pool of patients that you can, recruit into your clinical trial does become bigger. So I think patient support is an absolute must, but I think there are some of these more logistical requirements or barriers around clinical trials, the design that can also be shaped better, similar to what Ricki said. Just offering transportation, maybe reducing the number of visits that the patient needs to make to the site, just appreciating the burden that takes onto your patient population. That's helpful in retaining these patients. A lot of times you'll see patients dropping out of clinical trials. They just cannot keep up with the logistical burden of being part of a clinical trial. So I think just understanding the demographics of that patient population, understanding the language barriers, translating materials, making sure that the patients know what they're getting themselves into, in their own local language.
80% of cancer patients go to a community hospital. So they're not going to the big hospitals, right? And so we've worked really hard to build this list of PIs. When anyone comes to us and says, we have this great doctor, I have a great oncologist, I write them down, I call them. And so we've now built this list. So when pharma comes to us and says, here's our site list, I'll say, no, we're not going to go there. Here's the sites you can go to. And then, so we know we have doctors now that we have interacted with. I write them a love letter every month about whatever I'm thinking about at the moment. I just wrote one today, but I try to engage with these doctors to just have a relationship with them. And then in each of the communities where the doctors are, we find a support group or a church ministry or an advocate that's just really powerful in our neighborhood who's actually in the community working. And a lot of these women don't have 501c3 status. They've never been to ASCO. They've never been to SABCS, but they're in the community doing the work. And so we try to partner them with a local PI and say, here's a community of women that are right in your neighborhood that could be a source for the trials, right, to recruit from, but also to build a community around the people who are in your trials. So because we can't be everywhere, our organization, we'd have these tentacles. And we're now in 42 states. We have 101 doctors and organizations that are sort of interacting now to build a community around the women that are doing this work and the doctors doing this work. We try to help them out because they have good intentions. They want to do the right thing too.
A friend of mine close to me who was part of the clinical research field, she was in India. She was unfortunately suffering from a rare type of cancer. And being in the field of clinical trials and clinical research, she knew about trials that were happening here in the US and was able to fight for herself or get herself into this clinical trial. And she had the means and the ability to travel, come here. She had, caregiver support. She had family support for her kids. And she was able to come here. She was able to be a part of the clinical trial. But what I wanted to just kind of underline here is the fact that she was able to do that because she had a lot of support and the fact that she was part of the clinical trial industry. Put someone else in her shoes. I highly doubt that this person would have had any idea that there were clinical trials already in place, that it was even an option for her or for this person. So just kind of going back, I think we need a lot more visibility on clinical trials. What do they mean? How do they keep going? What's involved? And not just within your local geography, but being able to expand that into different countries, and then making sure that the physicians in those countries know about these clinical trials. So I think that communication needs to just happen for patients, for physicians to know more.
Frankly, a clinical trial should be part of a treatment plan. As a doctor is going over your treatment options, a trial should be part of it, right? I mean, you can do this, or you can do this, right? And I think that that's where we have to sort of get to and helping people understand that. But when I was sick and my doctor gave me 2 years to live and said, okay, Ricki, you have metastatic breast cancer. I don't have anything more for you. I said, well, I can't really die right now. And I went and fought for myself. I had no idea what a clinical trial was. I had no idea what I was even looking for, except for I wanted to watch my kid graduate from Dartmouth, and I had to pay tuition. So I just started digging around, Googling around, trying to figure out where I could go to get help. And I found this wonderful doctor at Emory who said, I'm going to put you on a trial drug. I didn't know what that was, but it was a way out. It was a solution. And it was more the best thing I had at the time. And when I finally, like a year later, I said, oh gosh, that was a trial. But I mean, in the moment, it was like, how can I stay alive to pay for my kids to go to college? Right. And so I think that people find they're not looking for a trial. They're looking for a life. Patients don't do trials because they want to advance science. They want to have a birthday. They want to have a grandchild. They want to watch their kid like I did to graduate from college. So that's why people do them. And I think we have to change even how we talk about them, because it should be just a treatment option that helps you stay alive.
I feel like the word that I'm thinking about is hesitation. And do you believe that oncologists might just be hesitant to even go to the topic of a clinical trial because what gets carried with that is the idea that, hey, I've run out of options. My treatment plan has reached a point where now we're talking about something completely different with that patient.
So I think that's two ways, right? So for example, if the physician just does not know about the trial, then it's going to be hard to even suggest that. But if the physician does know about the clinical trial, sometimes the hesitation just stems from the fact that they think they're going to have to extrapolate the data. Say, for example, the physician is in India and the clinical trial that they really want their patient to be on is not in India. And they know that the evidence base that was part of this clinical trial did not include the demographics, did not include a lot of Indians. And so this physician is just going to have to really think, is this drug going to be able to work for my patient population with this comorbidity or with these genetics? They're just not going to have enough information. And the hesitation in a lot of times just stems from that. They just don't have enough evidence to make an informed decision or to even suggest an informed decision to their patients.
Hesitation's a hard word because, first of all, I don't think a trial should be a last resort from the doctor's perspective or the patient's perspective, right? It should be something that it's a consideration. And I think some doctors do trials, some doctors don't. And I think eventually it's going to be on the patient's responsibility to go find the one that does for them. Do you know what I mean? I think some doctors just, I don't want to say take the easy way out, but they have the standard of care. And even in the breast oncology world, if you're in a community hospital, you're not necessarily going to a breast oncologist. You're going to the oncologist who handles all the cancers. So it would be hard for someone to be abreast of all of the trials for every cancer that they're dealing with, right? And so unless they make a concerted effort to stay on top of the research and on top of the data, they're probably not going to recommend a trial. And it's probably a harder way out, right? So then it sort of becomes the onus of the patient to go say, hold on, I want to consider this thing. And that's how we try to educate people to help them feel informed and equipped to have these conversations with doctors, because the doctors may not know.
But also some of the community oncologists or community oncology practices just don't have that kind of bandwidth. We've been seeing a lot of pharma companies try and reach out and work with academic institutions and community care practices to kind of operationalize the treatment paradigms and the treatment regimens. But that's a hard connection to make. And there's just not enough resources to go around. So
Right.
the physician may want to do more for their patients and want to include their patients, but they just don't have the bandwidth, just don't have the resources. And a lot of times they just don't even have the information. So I think, kind of going back to one of the points I made earlier, we need to have the pharma companies and sponsors really make that information come down the pipeline so that it comes down to the community care, practices, and then to the patients.
Ricki, you said something there that I think just feels patently unfair, to say that at some point the onus is going to swing over onto a patient who has already undergone, whatever they've, had to go through for treatments and the impact that it has on them mentally, their families. And then to say, well, now at some point it's up to them to go try to advocate for their own care, to fight, which you said a few different times. That's in and of itself a heartbreaking situation to think about.
I wish they didn't have to. I wish I didn't have to, but I did. And maybe because I experienced it myself, that I had to go fight for myself, that I can sort of see it happening. And that's what I feel like, especially for Black women, they have to ask for the care. They have to say, hold on. And we had one blessee who I love dearly. She passed a few years ago, but she used to say, "Doctor, today I do not want the McDonald's drive-through appointment. I want the Ruth Chris appointment. I want the cocktail, the appetizer, the salad, the mango. I want all the things." And that's what we teach people. You go in there and you ask for the Ruth Chris appointment. Please take your hand off the doorknob. I'm not done yet. And we try to equip them with the information and the questions they need to ask, because, I do think they have to get the care that they deserve. They almost have to ask for it. And I hate that has to happen. I wish our system allowed for more, but I do think doctors are overworked. They're given 15 minutes, and I think a lot's on their plate. And if they're dealing with multiple cancers, they may not know the latest breast thing on triple negative breast cancer. That's whatever, 10% of the population. So therefore, the patient, to get the best care she can get, she's got to walk in there with her guns loaded, with her pockets full, with all the information she needs. And that's what we do. We try to equip them so they can ask.
Patients don't even know that they can advocate for themselves or that they should be pushing for themselves. Oh, I can speak for myself, or I can ask for something or demand better care.
We basically teach people that you are the CEO of your own health. You're hiring that doctor as a service. If you went to the store and bought some shoes and they didn't fit, what would you do? Right? You would take them back.
Do you educate some of the patients that you work with at all about overcoming inherent bias, or is that something that you talk about? Like,
oh, yeah.
Yeah. And what's the response to that, among your average patient that you're speaking with?
Well, I can't get rid of racism, or I can't. I wish I could. And in this environment, it's kind of crazy, right? But I can empower women. And so that's where I put my energy. And I think just knowledge is power. So when I can teach women what they need to know or what questions to ask, then hopefully the racism and the illicit bias will go away or get minimized by the answer to the question or by the information. But also, I'll tell people in a heartbeat, you can fire your doctor. I've actually been thrown out of many oncologist offices with patients, even on FaceTime and Zoom, where I said, okay, well, when you try this treatment plan with the Black one, what happened? Didn't really work, did it? So help me understand that. So I do teach people to challenge and to feel empowered and equipped to ask the questions. Put on your big old panties and fight for yourself, So I do that. I think I want people to feel like they do have the ability to challenge and ask the questions that they need to get the care they deserve. And it starts with the golden rule, Okay, doctor, I want you to treat me like your family. If this were your mama or your auntie or your kid or your dad or somebody in your family or you, how would you want to be treated? And frankly, at some point, every doctor is going to take off that doctor robe and put on that robe with your butt hanging out, be sitting in a doctor's office and become a patient, right? And so I remind them, if you were the patient, how would you feel? It's what your mother taught you when you were 2 years old, right? And that's how I get people to talk to their doctors.
I employ that technique whenever I go to the doctor, and I suggest it for everybody in my family. And I'm sure the situation for this is the same for you too. You're probably the de facto healthcare provider in your family. Everybody comes to you with all the questions. No, I do the same. Just, doctor, like, if you were me, what would you do right now? Would you do this? Would you take this? And then you get a very different response. And I think it's one that's a little bit more human. So I think that's great advice. So, Ricki, one other thing I'm curious about is what you described sounds to me like a very grassroots effort. You're talking about operating within local communities, local advocacy groups, and churches and other places like that where we know the community is really important, but again, on like a very local level. You also mentioned that you're operating in 42 states. So how hard has it been to scale up that operation? And does a really grassroots effort like a kind that I think you've identified is required here, can it possibly scale to the degree that it needs to?
So we have a national platform. Because I'm a marketing person, I have like sort of great media connections. And so I have a web series that I do every Wednesday night at 6:00. I've been doing it now for 6 years. We reach about 5,000 viewers. And so that gives us sort of this national voice. And we have loyal followers. I don't really know who these people are, but they come back every week and we talk about everything, kind of like we're sitting here at the kitchen table. So I have a great co-host, Monique Gary. She's a breast surgical oncologist from Pennsylvania. So she kind of brings the doctor voice. I bring the patient voice, and we have people on talking about everything. I mean, I meet people all over and we just talk about what's going on. So that gives us our platform. And then we have this local outreach. We do about 100 events across the country in a year. And then we have these partnerships in 42 states. So it's kind of a top and bottom perspective. We try to be in the community, in people's faces, looking them eye to eye, talking and educating. But then we also have a national platform. And we have 3 different web series that we do. My daughter does a show called Pink Table Talk for young women. We also have an HBCU internship program. So at any given moment, we have about 10 college interns. They're all sophomore and junior pre-med students. And so they're in the community also working with us. So it's kind of, all the things. I don't think it's one or the other. And so I would like to say we have some level of scale because of our national media presence, but there's never enough. There's always room for more.
Yeah. So I feel like there's so many different ways to kind of approach these topics, because every time we're talking about one thing, I'm like, okay, so that's health literacy here, or there's access challenges here. It just feels like such a broad topic with so many different places and ways to attack it that I get kind of gripped with an impossible, like, you must be an incredible optimist, I think, Ricki, to even be, doing what you're doing day in and day out.
It's my God job. My doctor gave me 2 years to live. I'm on 14. It's my God job. So I wouldn't know anything else. And there's such a need. But you said the magic words, health literacy. That's what we're missing. I really do believe that health illiteracy is driving health disparities and health inequities because people just don't know what they don't know. And they learn about things in a crisis. It's like when you're studying for the test the night before the test because you're in a crisis, right? So you're throwing all this information when you're least able to handle it. So that's why you need a support system and care around you and everything. But, if I had a lot of money, I would build a beautiful Victorian house in every Black neighborhood where you walk down the street, you open that wrought iron gate, you walk up on the porch, the beautiful Black grandmother gives you a hug, takes your 3 kids into the playroom, feeds them spaghetti, takes you into the treatment room, sits you down in a cushy chair, gives you a cup of tea, a little blanket that she made, turns on Luther Vandross, and gives you the shot. And so we try to bring the love around it. You know what I mean? That's what we have to do. So you have to inform people. And I wish they learned about clinical trials in high school, in biology class. Because when you need it, it's way too late.
What are your thoughts about health literacy? Because we talk about it all the time. Health literacy is so much deeper and more extensive than I think that people even begin to give it credit for. I think sometimes in our business, it gets boiled down to keep it at a 5th grade level. That's not health literacy. It is simply just one very kind of narrow domain of it.
I have to say we've come again, a long way in health literacy. If I compare myself to my daughter, she's 16 now, what I knew about health and cancer or any disease state is nothing compared to what she knows right now. We've definitely made progress in the right direction. Is it ever enough? Probably not. To that effect, I see pharma companies do a lot in terms of educating physicians and not just academic institutions. I see a lot of focus on community care physicians as well and sites that are community based in trying to make them understand what the drug is or what is the intent behind it, what is the science, so that it's easier to understand in this world where we just don't have time. So health literacy is definitely getting better. We're understanding in this time poor world how to get those messages across to different strata of our population. We're seeing a push towards consent forms that are available in the local language, and kind of breaking down even the consent forms have become easier to understand. The science is there, but it's in simpler terminology. So I think we're making progress, and pharma needs to continue on that path, and hopefully physicians pick up on it and then transfer it to their patient populations as well.
I think it's our job as advocates to be educators and do this work to help people be informed. And then there's always Dr. Google. And now there's Dr. ChatGPT and Dr. Gemini and Dr. Claude. And they worry me a little bit because, kind of what goes in comes out. And I don't feel really good about it, but it's happening and it's going to continue to happen. So I think we all have a responsibility to make sure the inputs are in there. Like women call me all the day and say, should I pay the extra $40 for the AI mammogram? And I say, I can't really tell you if it's going to give you a better result, but do it anyway so we get the data. So the more we can participate in the data and the inputs, I hope we'll have better outcomes. Right now, it scares me a little bit, but people go straight there.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So my husband is actually a physician, so he gets a lot of this where a patient will show up and be like, well, ChatGPT told me that I should start with this kind of a treatment regimen. And it's just a shock to a physician to kind of have technology kind of work almost against them in a way. Having said that, I don't think there's any running away from technology. So I think we just need to be aware, learn from the tech that's already there and use it to our advantage to get the message out there in the right possible way, incorporating tech to do your job for you so that it reaches as many people as it can. I think that's possibly the way forward.
I think, though, what that tells you, though, that people are going to tech because they don't trust what the doctor's going to say or they want to have options. Literally, they want control. I want control over my destiny. I want control over what's going to happen to me. And so I'm going to use everything I can to be in control. So I think we're using all the things that we can to feel in control of our situation.
Yeah. Ricki, what do you hear is one of the most common complaints among the patients that you work with about how their doctor actually communicated with them relative to health literacy? Is it literally the vocab that they're using? Is it something that just wasn't discussed? Is it, something else that you've heard from patients like, I just don't understand this?
It's time. Because if I don't understand it, they didn't take the time to explain it to me, right? So they're using the big words, they're saying all the things, but if they took 10 more minutes, would I walk out feeling better? Even our research that we did showed that even when the patient brought up a clinical trial to a doctor, she still walked away feeling ill-equipped to go defend herself to her friends who said, you're going to get the sugar pill. She still walked away feeling like not confident in the answer that she got. So it's just not spending enough time on what we need, and being able to answer the questions in words you can spell with, but it's taking the time to say, okay, let me break this down for you. And that's what I do on my show a lot, especially when I have doctors on. Okay, hold on. Talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Give me the 2nd grade version of this, not the 6th grade version, but the 2nd grade version, and tell me what this means. And I think patients are afraid to do that because they're rushed. They're sick. They don't know what to do. And so It's if they spent more time, which is really hard. We know that for the way our system works, but that's the complaint.
So to go back to one of the other things I think that we also discussed, and Nirzari, you mentioned this because we were talking about hesitation, and I think, Rick, you're a little bit unsure, uncomfortable maybe with that word. But I think what I was also talking about is doctors have to operate within a certain degree of uncertainty when it comes to the care that they're suggesting. And it's not possible, right? The pace of innovation being what it is, an oncologist can't keep up. So is it acceptable for a doctor to operate with some uncertainty when it comes to the care they're prescribing?
I mean, I think there will always be that uncertainty. I think it's the scope of uncertainty that a physician is most comfortable with. That is really the question here. So an oncologist is never going to be 100% sure that this treatment is going to work for a certain patient. But how much is that extrapolation of data that they're going to have to do to have some sense of certainty whether or not this will be applicable to their patient population, I think is key here. And that's where the bigger the clinical trial in terms of inclusivity, in terms of a more diverse patient population, which makes your evidence a lot more stronger, that gives the physician some sense of comfort or some sense of certainty. I think I can make this work, or I think this patient is right for this treatment. So I think that that's really what it truly depends on.
I really think, that we need to have clinical trial participation, I said earlier, commensurate with the burden of disease. So if you take a disease like triple negative breast cancer, where Black women get it at 2.7 times the rate of white women, I'm not smart enough to do that math, but the women in those trials should reflect those numbers, right? That's what we should be thinking about in terms of how we build the trials. And so if you're thinking about Black women, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but X% of Black women have high blood pressure, have, obesity or whatever issues are, like, or diabetes, whatever. I think the real world needs to be reflected in what goes into a trial. So if you make the trial so pristine that there's no sort of biological factors happening on the people in the trial, what good is that drug going to do? Especially when you're talking about a disease like triple negative breast cancer or ER positive breast cancer. If we have to build drugs that work for people. You're not building them for the lab rat, right? So I think that's how we have to think about it. It's got to be real. It's got to reflect the real world. And so it shouldn't be exclusionary. It should be inclusionary.
I think there needs to be extensive research done on the disease burden and what it looks like in different geographies, because what it's going to look like in one part of the country may not necessarily look the same in another part or in a different race or ethnicity. So I think that sort of research becomes crucial. Also understanding community sites within these areas, if it's dominated by a particular race or ethnicity, are there community sites that are available there? Do they have the bandwidth to be able to recruit these patients? So I think there's so many, as you said, Evan, there's so many different ways you can come at this from. But, it all kind of starts with a lot of research, the intent to make everything as inclusive as they possibly can, and then kind of chart a way forward.
Yeah. So if we were to chart a way forward, how could we possibly start to do that? And maybe I could start by asking, what would be a positive step that you could look at a year from now, 5 years from now, that would be different from where we are today?
I look forward to having representation that's commensurate with the burden of disease in 5 years. And I know that what we're doing is working. I feel really good about it. I have great success stories. We did the first trial that we worked on with one of pharma companies. They had 2% Black women in the trial. 18 months later, we closed it with 14. And that's by providing marketing materials that were relevant, that were, culturally humble, and connect with people in a way that makes them, motivates them to trial. And then our navigation, it works. I've seen it work, and I think we're now starting to get some traction with other companies. But if we could do more of it, I know we could do more. So I'm not sure if I know that my path is working. There are probably others that are working, but I think we should figure out what the collective wealth of what's working, put it all together and do better. But it takes intention and commitment.
Is there any way that you could actually begin to measure specifically the things that are working and not? I mean, you said you came from marketing. We do a lot of research in marketing.
Yeah, we measure everything. We measure
Yeah.
everything. We measure every contact with a patient. And frankly, our program is set up so, pharma companies can't really interact with patients on a trial, right? But we can. And so we track all the data, all of our conversations. What are we talking about? What are the things that are bothering them? What kind of services do we provide? So we track all of that. So we have a realm of data that we can go back and say, over the life of this trial, here are the issues that came up. On the 5th chemo, everybody got a headache. On the 4th chemo, everybody got scared. Whatever the issues are, we're tracking that information so we can build a story around how to do this better. It's new to many companies, but I think when the pharma company gives us the reins to talk to patients, it's a new day. But we can be that thing, and we interact with the PIs if there's any kind of adverse effects. But it's really more about giving a hug. We get a lot of calls after dinner, after the woman comes home from work, because she still may be working, right, with even metastatic breast cancer, and can't call the doc or call somebody while she's there. Or she's been at chemo today and she comes home and talks to her family and like, well, why'd that happen? And we can talk them off the ledge and just give them that hug and that reinforcement that here's how when you get that pain, just take an Advil, take a Tylenol, make yourself feel better, or go take a walk, or here's a yoga class in your neighborhood, or here's some recipes for you to try to deal with the side effects. It's simple things like that make people feel better.
Yeah.
That mental health thing is really important as part of this whole exercise.
So then you're saying that your efforts are making a difference, which is incredible. However, any of those much larger domains, whether that's kind of structural racism, which I know is a really hard topic to even try to get to, how do we address that? To any other thing, whether that's designing our trials differently. If there's any one thing that you would just say, like, I know this is possible for us to change. If only we could bring together X and Y and Z, this is the thing that would make the biggest difference.
So one of my favorite quotes is Albert Einstein, a problem cannot be solved within which the framework it was created. And I think people are stuck in a box. This is how I've always done it. That's the worst thing we can be doing right now. And for me, my purpose in all of these conversations about trials is to get better drugs. I mean, the drugs right now, people are dying. Black women under 35 get breast cancer at twice the rate of white women, are dying at 3 times the rate. If you're under 40 and you're diagnosed with breast cancer as a Black woman, you have a 50% of having triple negative breast cancer. Right now, we know that 63% of Black women get ER positive breast cancer, which we call the good one. That's the one we got lots of stuff for. Well, guess what? They're dying in 15 years, they're getting a recurrence. And 20 years they're getting a recurrence because the tamoxifen failed them, because they didn't they didn't stick with it, or for whatever reason, the drugs are not working. And so we have to get better drugs. So in 5 years, I want better drugs. And that's a tall order. And to get there, we have to fix everything about the system, whether it's how the trials are orchestrated, how the science works and how we recruit. But all of the things have to get us to the place where these young women aren't dying. They need drugs that work. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's why I'm doing this. I don't want my grandbabies. I don't want my daughters to deal with this. I definitely don't want my grandbaby. I have 4 granddaughters. I don't want them to even think about boobs. I want them to, I want them to be like on a different planet.
And Nirzari, from your point of view, what do you think? What does this best possible outcome or world look like in a few years when we're not solving anything in a few years, so this is a pie in the sky question, but
you don't know about that. We may be.
Hey, AI may have something else to say about it. Who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's all about communication. Maybe I'm looking at things a little bit more optimistically, but I think the intent is there from the pharma companies, from physicians, from patients. And I think what we can work on better is how to best communicate the information that's coming out of these clinical trials in the right possible way. So I think just articulating the data that we have is key, making sure that we're reaching every possible patient so that they can get the right treatment at the right time.
Yeah. So Nirzari, Ricki, thank you both very much for coming on. I hope you've had a great conversation here. I think, Ricki, for sure the efforts that you've put into this are reaping rewards in the real world. And, for women that are getting better treatments as a result of those efforts, kudos to you. So again, thank you both very much.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
Thanks for having us.
So let's go back to LaToya Bolds Johnson. When her oncologist wouldn't put her on that drug that she asked for, in her words, she fired him. From there, LaToya did indeed go on to find a new oncologist. She started on that IO treatment, and her story has what I'll call not a happy ending, but a happy continuation. Because today, LaToya is going strong. Thank you for joining me on Within Reach, a podcast hosted by me, Evan Young, and produced by Avalere Health with the help of Podcast Labs. For more Within Reach content, including in-depth reports about cutting-edge topics in oncology, patient stories, articles, and more, visit withinreach.avalerehealth.com. You'll also be able to meet our SenseMaker experts who have worked hard to bring Within Reach to life. To get in touch, email us at withinreach@avalerehealth.com or follow us on LinkedIn. And who is Avalere Health? Avalere Health is a global strategic partner for the healthcare industry, working across the breadth of the product lifecycle to ensure every patient is identified, treated, supported, and cared for equally. Our advisory, medical, and marketing teams come together powerfully and intentionally to forge unconventional connections, building a future where healthcare is not a barrier and no patient is left behind. If you'd like to support Within Reach, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Your input helps us make the podcast even better, points us to topics that are relevant to you, and helps us reach new listeners. All you have to do is open up the podcast app on your phone, look for Within Reach, scroll down until you see it, write a review, and tell us what you think. Join me next time as we continue to uncover issues in oncology and work toward their solutions here on Within Reach from Avalere Health.